Thanks for joining me for this edition of the Author's Corner, brought to you by KNEO 91.7 FM The Word. I'm Roberta Foster, and today I welcome John G. West to Author's Corner. He's the author of the book Endowed by Our Creator, The Bible, Science, and the Battle for America's Soul, and it's published by Discovery Institute Press. He'll tell you more about how to find the book at the end of the program. A little bit about John. He is the Vice President of Discovery Institute and the Distinguished Scholar of American Government and Christian Civic Engagement at Cornerstone University. He formerly chaired the Department of Political Science at Seattle Pacific University, and he holds a PhD in government from Claremont Graduate University. He's an author of many books, including Stockholm Syndrome Christianity and Darwin Day in America. John, thank you so much for being with us on Author's Corner.
Roberta, thank you for having me.
So off air, you told me you started this book about 6 months ago. What was happening in America or taking place in science that you felt it was a critical time to write this book?
Yeah, well, I actually was on vacation with my wife and was swimming, and I liked to reflect and was actually praying even, and it sort of came over me that this year is a very important year, the 250th anniversary of America, and that I was recalling all the college students that I taught didn't quite understand some of the founding principles of the country, and I recognized that I think I have some unique things to say, not just about the founding of America and the Declaration of Independence and what it means, but really the battle that we've had arising starting in the 19th century, then through the Progressive Era and to today, in really challenging some of the underlying principles that were that grew out of, say, a biblical worldview, but also the view of science at the time of the founders actually supported the idea of a creator, for example. And interestingly enough, just in the last few weeks, we've had a Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who gave quite a noted speech that has provoked a lot of debate about how central the Declaration of Independence is to our self-understanding, and also the challenge, how it was challenged by the Progressive Era, people like Woodrow Wilson and others, and that we're living in that era right now where many people really don't necessarily either understand or support the principles on which America was based. So I'm hoping to illuminate why those principles are still good for today and really the battle that's going on about them.
Endowed by Our Creator is the title of the book. Is that one of the greatest challenges to the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah, so the founders believed that our rights come from God, not from human beings, and that people might think, oh, that's just rhetoric, and that doesn't really matter. But in fact, it wasn't just rhetoric for them, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But it does matter, because if we look throughout much of human history, much of modern history, most revolutions have gone terribly wrong. Whether it be the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and now. They don't actually bring freedom. They actually bring bloodshed. And even at the time of the American founding, just within a decade or two, we had the French Revolution, which turned into a bloodbath. Now, what was one of the key differences? Well, one was our understanding of how we're created equal, including in our fallenness and our sinfulness, and so that we can't create utopia here. Another, especially against the revolutions in our own, say, last 100 years, was the idea, well, where do our rights come from? And if the rights come from God, then the idea is that other human beings, including the government, cannot rightfully take them away. And so that sets up the idea of limited government. The government is limited in its functions. It's very important, but it's supposed to secure our unalienable rights, not to override them. And the founders strongly believed that. And unfortunately, today, the idea that our rights come from God, we just did a survey in conjunction with my book of 2,500 Americans, and only a minority, only about 4 in 10 Americans today think that our rights come from God. And we have sitting United States senators, Tim Kaine from Virginia, who just last year was saying, oh, believing your rights come from God, that's like Iran. That's not America. And so, people really misunderstand it. And again, the idea that rights come from God is a protection It's not calling for theocracy. It's calling for that means that there are some rights that even government isn't supposed to trample on. And societies who think that our rights primarily come from society end up having a trajectory of where they trample on your rights. So, but getting back to the idea of that there is a creator, it's really interesting. That wasn't just a faith statement by the founders. They were drawing on, interestingly enough, and I'm one of the very few people who have written on this, the science of their time. Many people don't realize that the scientific revolution was largely done by devout Christians who thought that nature provided evidence, objective evidence of a creator. And of course, the Bible itself teaches that, with Paul talking about in Romans that, the nature actually points to God. But the founders of modern scientists, Newton, Kepler, Galileo, they all thought that nature pointed to God. And the founders read many of those people. I actually talk about that in my book. And so when they said that we're endowed by our creator and laws of nature and nature's God, they thought that was an objective statement of reality. It wasn't just a fairy story. It wasn't just something they subjectively believed. They thought nature, creation itself, points to a creator. And so that was behind their statement. And a lot of them wrote about that. And again, very few scholars have ever looked at that part of the founders. So that's one of the unique things in my book, that the evidence that the founders thought that nature provided of a creator.
And that's certainly very encouraging when you think about the fact that if they had that attitude so many years ago, 250 years ago, it's digressed from that stalwart belief for today. So you say there's new science pointing back to the key truths proclaimed by the Declaration. We're going to get to that in just a moment after I remind the listeners I'm talking with John G. West regarding his book, Endowed by Our Creator, The Bible, Science, and the Battle for America's Soul, published by Discovery Institute Press. You're listening to Author's Corner, and I'm Roberta Foster. So do you have some new scientific points that you can tell us that points back to the proclamation of the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah, so the founders claim that there is a creator who endows us with rights, and also that he created us equal, so that although we have many differences, we're not equal in everything, and the founders didn't think that, but in our fundamental capacities, they thought humans were much more equal to each other than any of us were, say, to plants or to insects or to dogs, for example. And those two core beliefs, that there's a creator and he created us equal, and that's actually why government should be based on our consent, not just elite trampling over us. Those two beliefs came under great attack in the name of science, with people like Charles Darwin and others who said, no, we're fundamentally unequal. There are races that are higher or lower than others, and that because we're fundamentally unequal, we actually, consent of the government isn't important. We should be ruled by elites who are experts, who are so superior to us, they can rule us without our consent. So they denied that so many of these people in the name of science denied that we were equal. And then they also ultimately ended up denying that there's a creator, because they said, no, nature shows that we're the product of an unguided process. That was Darwin's key view. Well, what has happened? So that was sort of a repudiation of the founding, and it led to also the rise of sort of that government is in the place of God. A lot of things that happened that Clarence Thomas, Justice of the Supreme Court, talked about just a few days ago. Well, what's happening now is that, in fact, the latest science is actually pointing back to what the founders were pointing at. So, for example, scientists now generally are conceding that there was a beginning to the material universe. And so a time before which there was no matter, energy, or time, and so that requires a cause outside of time, matter, and energy. Well, that's traditionally what people have, that sort of cause is what traditionally people have called God. I mean, and so science itself is pointing to the idea that the physical universe needs a creator that's outside the physical universe. Also, science is showing that the laws of nature, the laws of physics, couldn't just be anything. They have to be finely calibrated for life at all to exist. And so what many scientists have called the fine-tuning of the laws of physics, that if they were even slightly different, life wouldn't just be different, we wouldn't exist. And so that also points toward a creator. And then one other big finding of science is that inside ourselves. We're finding, we understand now modern genetics. Well, DNA, most scientists regard it's like a code. It actually gives instructions. Well, a code usually requires a coder. And so that finding of codes within our genes and the fine-tuning and the fact that there needs to be a beginning to the physical universe all are pointing towards a creator, just like the founders believed, just like that actually were. Science today is going back to the ideas of the early scientists who saw that. And so on the area of being a creator, that's one thing. And then also in the area of human equality, many things have now come out about how humans are very different from other animals. And so, in fact, just last year, I write about this in the book, we've been hearing that, well, humans are just like 1% different than chimps in their DNA. Turns out that's not true. And in fact, there was a major study published by the world's most prestigious science journal of Nature. They sort of hid this fact that I'm giving you in an appendix, but their research actually showed this, that actually we're about 14 to 15% different. So in other words, 14 to 15 times more different, our DNA is more different than chimps by a factor of 14 or 15 times more than what they were saying. And of course, there are also radical differences in language. I talk about the experiments that have been made to try to teach chimps or apes to speak. They have some limited ability for doing hand motions and doing some things. But the really interesting thing is the studies have actually shown the dramatic difference. By the time of like a human child is 2 or 3, they begin to outstrip anything we can teach chimps or apes. We are fundamentally different and fundamentally more equal to each other. There's also just one other factoid, sort of against the people who claim that that science shows that races are inherently unequal to each other. Actually, the latest scientific evidence shows that the variations, the genetic variations, say, between different ethnic groups are there are much more variation within one ethnic group than there are between any of the ethnic groups. And so actually genetically, human beings pretty much are equal. Now, this doesn't deny that the founders didn't say that we all have math ability or that we're all worthy of being a professional sports stars. That's not what they were talking about with human equality. And I actually go in the earlier chapter of the book and talk about 7 concrete ways that the founders thought we were equal. One is that unlike other animals, we actually do have rational capacities. Right. The others were our founders thought we had and this is in line with the Christian teaching, that we have an eternal soul. And in fact, James Wilson, who was a Supreme Court justice, who was one of the few people who actually signed both the Declaration of Independence and he helped draft the Constitution. So he was one of the bigwigs among the founders, and he talked about how humans have a soul and how that makes us different than the other animals. They also thought, as I mentioned before, that in a negative way, we're equal in that we're all corruptible and sinful. And that is one of the real differences that has made our revolution not turn into a bloodbath like the French Revolution did. Because the French Revolution, they thought humans were perfectible. And they also thought rights ultimately came from, although they paid lip service to God, they thought that our rights actually come from the general will, which is the general will of society. Well, our founders knew that no human was so superior that we could just trust them to come up with rights. So those are some of the ways that the modern science is pointing both to a creator and to human equality.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we just touched the surface of what you have written in your book, but our time prevents us from going too much further into it. But right now, John, why don't you tell our listeners how they can find out more about your book, Endowed by Our Creator?
Yeah, well, they can easily get it at Amazon or BarnesandNoble.com or various places. They can go to my website, johngwest.com, where it has a section on the book, and they can click through and see some of the endorsements and get a little more detail. So johngwest.com, or they can actually get the book at places like Amazon.
Thank you. So one more time, the book today is called Endowed by Our Creator, The Bible, Science, and the Battle for America's Soul, and it's published by Discovery Institute Press, and we're so thankful for receiving a copy of this book. And John, it's been very enlightening for myself to talk with you today, and I sure appreciate your time.
I appreciate the interview, and hope you have a great rest of your day. And I hope people will really think about what the Declaration of Independence means. This is the year to do it, our 250th anniversary as a nation.
Fantastic. So to our listeners, if you'd like to hear this interview again or share it with another, you can find it on your favorite podcast platform or through kneo.org. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is Roberta Foster on the Author's Corner. Join me again next time.